All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 Buckeye Book Fair. Thank you for joining us for this series of virtual events with Ohio authors and illustrators. The Buckeye Book Fair provides an annual celebration of literacy through author visits, educational programs for K through 12 students, and events for people of all ages. All of the books featured today and throughout the entire book fair are available for purchase at buckeyebookfair.org. Should you have any questions, and in this particular session, I know it's primarily focused on Q&A, please type them in the Q&A or the chat, and Terry and or I will monitor them through the presentation. We are happy to have Terry Pluto join us today for Terry's Talking, his book about vintage Cavaliers. So the Cleveland Arena and Richfield Coliseum are long gone, but they and the Cavs teams from 1970s to the 1990s are come alive in vintage Cavs, a warm look back at the Cavaliers of the Cleveland Arena and Richfield Coliseum years. This is a personal history of the Cavs by a sports writer who was there as a young fan and later as an NBA beat writer. From expansion team to the brink of greatness with Austin Carr, Hot Rod Williams, and Mark Price, these stories will take you back to vintage Cavs moments. So I'm very happy to welcome Terry Pluto.
Well, I'm glad to be doing this. And by the way, we're going to need questions because part of what's going to make this work is you. I have some things I want to say up front and that, but I really, the great thing about being a sports writer is not just that I could go to games. As my father once said to me when I was complaining about something, he goes, I don't want to hear it. You get to go to games for free. And this is a guy that worked in a food warehouse, the old Fisher Foods, later Fisher Fazio Costa food warehouse. And I actually worked there through college too. So I had an idea what he was talking about. And I remember seeing people I grew up in Cleveland with the Plain Dealer and the old Cleveland Press. They'd have it at the warehouse. And I would think, boy, if one day, this is how far it goes. If I could earn my living with a typewriter, that would be just something really special to do. And that those guys in the warehouse or somewhere else would be reading my stories, like they did Hal Lebowitz or many Chuck Heaton, many of the other writers from that era. That would mean so much to me. And suddenly now I've been getting, this is what happens when you've been covering sports for like 4,000 years. I've been getting these emails and things saying, you remind me of Hal Lebowitz or this. And that's really high praise. And now also as I've gotten older, what I've discovered too is that kind of things that are, whether it's nostalgia or part of what makes sports work is memory. And what the impetus for Vintage Cats came, I like to hike, and I like especially to hike at the Cuyahoga Valley National Park and all those things. We're really blessed to, by the way, have those parks in this area between Cleveland and Akron and that. But you go by there, and there's the Coliseum, but there's not the Coliseum. There's just this big field off of 271 and 303 there. Just, in fact, there's no sign. You would never guess was there. And I would think about that periodically because I love covering the Cavs. I covered them as a beat person from 1985 through 93. And that actually was the whole Lenny Wilkens, Mark Price, that era. But I remember talking to Mark Price about that once. This was a few years ago. And I said, hey, Mark, have you been out to where the Coliseum used to be? And he says, yeah, I went out there a few years ago and I looked and there's nothing there. He says, it's almost like it never happened. And I thought, well, it's true. I guess, by the way, you're getting older when you've been around long enough. I watched games at the old Cleveland Arena. That's long gone. Watch games at the Coliseum. That's long gone. So I give nothing else. I guess I've outlived two buildings. But where I really wanted to do was suddenly kind of write kind of a personal memoir and memory of the Cavs before LeBron. And I've written books on the comeback and the franchise on LeBron. So it's not like I have, didn't want to cash in on that or whatever. But really, I wanted to write kind of the basketball from a little different era and certainly different than what we see now with a lot of free agency and things. And so that's what started it. And what I also wanted to do was kind of talk to some of my favorites. By the way, I only have two bobbleheads. Number one is, here it comes. Oh, that is, hello. That is World B Free, who was one of my all-time. Yeah, I know. You know what World was telling me? He's saying if I played now, where everybody just has no conscience and shoots three-pointers, I'd be James Harden. I'd average 40 some points. Could be. Uh, it was such a different era when that World was on the first Cavs team I covered, which is the 85-86 Cavs. Not a particularly good team at all. It was the year after they made the playoffs with George Karl. Karl then gets fired during that year. But it was also a time when writers were allowed in to watch practice, and you get to know the players. And World used to play afterwards, 3 point um, horse games. And basically, it was all from behind the 3 point line. And obviously, I was not going to be able to shoot like World could. So he would spot me like 4 letters. I just had to try to get a letter on him to beat him. And didn't work out very well. Another thing that reminded me, it's a good thing I could write because I certainly couldn't play. One of World B Free's lines that I love so much is like, you could drug test me for anything, but just don't make it be Budweiser. He used to stop at the old, it's not Tavern of Richfield, Whitey's hamburger joint down there before the games. And he would have a cheeseburger and like some Pepsis and that. And then afterwards go back and stop there again and have a beer or two. And the waitresses all knew him and that. And I really think World Be Free, and Joe Tate agrees with me, World Be Free should have his old number 21 retired. What do you think, World? Do you think your number should be retired? He says, well, Nate Thurman's up there and all these other guys are up there. Yeah, I know. In fact, he is, other than LeBron, he's the second leading scorer in terms of points per game with the Cavs in Cavs history. And it came, right after the miserable time of Ted Stepien. And really, that was a time when the Cavaliers easily could have moved. And that was a really tough time. In fact, I have another guest, by the way. Here he comes. Oh, this is a little dangerous because he's not in as good a shape. There's Joe Tate. And Joe agrees with me about World. Is that right, Joe? And I know, not Wham with the right hand, but yes, World's number should be retired up in the and Joe's up there. And so a lot of this, sometimes as an author, you're blessed just to write about something that is dear to your heart, something that's fun to write about. And so that was something that really interested me, was kind of taking this look at the Cavs from when they were born back in 1970, through the Coliseum years, with some of the people that I knew and liked. All right. I see we have somebody in the chat. Let's go with a question. Do we have that question? And so, all right, here we go. I have a question from the internet about Terry's favorite sports stadium and or sports team to cover. Okay. I was actually talking with Les Levine about this, and Les has been a broadcaster here for a long time. And one of the things that we were saying is, where did you like to watch games? I mean, I grew up in a baseball family. The old stadium was fun to go to until I saw other places that teams played. And then you realize kind of what a mess the old stadium was. But really, the old Coliseum in Richfield was my favorite, and still is my favorite venue for basketball, and maybe altogether because the fans were closer. It also was a thing there where, it was loud, but it's nothing like, I'm going to sound like some grumpy old man, but when I would go to the Cavs games, or like at Golden State and I was covering the Cavs during the playoff runs, it is so loud. It's like they were afraid for 1 second of silence, as if people's brains would crack if they weren't being just inundated with all the noise and everything else. Where back at the Coliseum, yeah, they had music and things, but really it was kind of like listening to Burt Bacharach versus punk rock or something. It was very, very quiet. And so that was a thing there that I really enjoyed, was going to games at the Coliseum and seeing those things. And I think too, Um, what makes Cleveland special and the fans special is that you don't have to win a title to be loved by sports fans here. Of course, if you did, we wouldn't like anybody, but think about it. I mean, Bernie Kosar is probably the most beloved Browns player ever. I mean, I'm sure maybe some older fans would go back to, Otto Graham or Paul Brown or whatever, but at least, for a vast majority of, Bernie with the Browns never went to the Super Bowl with Bernie. He never did. It's not a knock, but I'm just saying he never went to the Super Bowl. Hal, excuse me, Sam Rutigliano, was loved as a coach, respected as a coach, never even won a playoff game with the Browns. But there was a sense with them that they were trying, that they represented, the area well, that they gave you a reason to watch. Part of sports is not just winning or losing. In fact, people who say, well, if the team doesn't win a title, it failed, and why should I really follow it? It's sort of like the championship mentality or nothing. That's kind of like saying, what you think about this for a moment. Suppose we all go out to eat, and if we don't get the best meal in the country that night, it wasn't a good meal. It wasn't a good time. That's just not true. Okay, so what does this have to do with the Cavs? There were a couple times in Cavs history before LeBron, before the title was won, when something magic and special happened, especially at the old Coliseum, and it made it so much fun to watch. The people wonder, what is the miracle of Richfield? Well, who cares about that? That was with Austin Carr and with Campy Russell and Jim Jones and Jimmy Clemens. Bill Fitch was the coach. Joe Tate literally screaming on the radio, those playoff games back then. So why is this a miracle? Well, number one is it came after the Cavs were born and played in this wretched old arena back in downtown Cleveland, where literally the rats were huge. They're about the size of small cats running around underneath, kind of in the tunnels and alleyways there, and also in the parking lot. In fact, Bill Fitch had a pistol that he kept. Bill told me the story, the coach, and he kind of took out a few rats with him because he didn't like. Sometimes he's sitting there and they were getting a little too close, and these boys had big teeth and didn't seem a whole lot of fun. And also back then, the team almost went broke a couple of times because Nick Milletti, who owned them, he was the master of other people's money, OPM. Nick at one point owned the Cavaliers. He owned what is now WTAM radio. He owned the Crusaders hockey team, and he also owned the Cleveland Indians. Now there are many partners in many of those, but the phenomenal thing was the Cavs were barely alive financially before they moved to Richfield. And by the way, that was a Nick Milletti idea because he tried to get something done downtown and got no help from the city back then in the early 70s. And if you remember Cleveland in the early 70s, pretty sad time, economically. And it just seemed like the whole town was sort of falling apart. And so he ended up moving out to the suburbs because his vision was he got this land cheap for free in Richfield, and that Akron and Cleveland would one day come together, and boom, they would be right in the middle of it. And he thought there'd be a big shopping mall there and a hotel and all these things with the stadium there. So that's why the Coliseum ended up when it did. But also, I think why it was so exciting because the Cavs were bad for the first several years, and then they began to win. And this was at the Coliseum the second year there. And then suddenly it was a fun place to go and watch games. And, Joe Tate told me, and Austin Carr, and several of these others that, especially towards the end of the 75-76 season when the team was driving for the playoffs and then knocked off Washington in the first round, that you would just hear that, let's go Cavs, let's go Cavs. And the walls would shake when the guys were in the locker room. And this was not done, by the fake noise coming out of the scoreboard, as they would say, organically, or in other words, naturally. It was the fans grabbing onto it. And part of the reason was that the fans in that era and that building were not priced out of the good seats near the floor. And so you would get just people who are excited to be there. And also, there is so much fun whether you're watching the Cavs when they start to get good, or like in the Browns in the 80s when they began to win, the Indians of the 90s, when you're coming out of a dreary era and you're coming out of losing. Uh, it's just the building and rising is a lot more fun than frankly trying to maintain, and so that has a newness and a freshness to it. So that was a part of the deal there, and I think that's what made that so exciting back in the Miracle of Richfield. They won all these close games against Washington, um, and for example, the Cavs opened their first year, 1970, 71, 1970. So they open, they lose 15 in a row, they win a game, and they lose 14 more. So at one point they're 1-29. Joe Tate told me he wasn't hired until the eighth game of the season. He was friends with here comes Joe. He's back. Okay, there you are. Uh-oh, you know what happened? His bottom fell off. My took a little injury there on my bobblehead. But Joe said so he's driving to Cleveland to pick up the Cavs the next night. And the Cavs were playing the Philadelphia 76ers. And he had the Philadelphia broadcast on his radio as he's driving. He was living in Indiana at the time and driving over. And the broadcasters for the Sixers, this is early in that very first season, is saying, this is the worst team we've ever seen. There's nobody in the stands. We're not even sure they're going to make the season. We hear they have no money. And Joe, who had just quit his radio job in Terre Haute, Indiana, is thinking, and he had a couple kids, and he's moving his family. He's going to make $100 a game doing the Cavs, and then hopefully pick up some other radio work. Thinking, what have I just done? And there were other times in those early years when it became a real concern whether they were going to make it financially. Austin Carr told me a story. Said it's his rookie year, and he goes and takes his one of his early paychecks to cash from the Cavaliers to the old Cleveland Trust Bank. And one of the vice presidents there came out to meet him, a Cavs player, and this and that. And then the vice president says to Austin, he says, Austin, if I were you, this is way before direct deposit and all that. If I were you, the moment you get one of those checks from the Cavaliers, I would bring it in here and cash it immediately. I'm not saying anything else. I'm just saying you would be very wise to come get your money right now. And so that was clearly, if the bank is telling you that, that is an issue. So as I continue to tell stories, I'm looking for other questions. We've only had one. So I'm hoping somebody else is out there and has something to say on that. So, but where I went, so I talked about the Miracle of Richfield thing, and then the other group of players, and that I think have really endeared themselves to Cavs fans. And this is my favorite team because I was blessed to cover that group, and that was the team with Mark Price and Ron Harper and Larry Nance Jr. I'm sorry, Larry Nance Sr. Excuse me. That's amazing. Larry Nance Jr. I remember seeing him just as a real little kid. I mean, yay big. Of course, now he's 6'10", but that Larry and Janie would bring to the games. And then later I saw Larry Nash Jr. playing for Revere High in Bath because Larry settled here after his career was over. And even though he's from South Carolina and his wife's from Phoenix, they found they really liked Northeast Ohio and stayed here. And then, of course, Larry played for Revere, and then later on played at Wyoming University. And, of course, he's now at the Cavaliers. But, to see him, Mark Price, and then also Hot Rod Williams, who I became really close with. And Hot Rod lived in Copley, and Mark Price lived in Hudson, and Craig Eagle lived in Fairlawn, and Lenny Wilkins lived also in Fairlawn. And Wayne Embry was a GM. Now he lived on the east side of Cleveland, I think, in the Beechwood area. But um, the team became really kind of a suburban team in that, because this Coliseum was in Richfield, a lot of them lived more towards Akron that way. And that's another team, kind of like the Browns of the 80s. They were really good and really fun to watch, but they never won a title. They couldn't get past the Chicago Bulls. They just couldn't. 5 times, 5 times, putting them right up there. 5 times the Bulls knocked the Cavs out of the playoffs during that time. But yet to watch the Cavs play, and I wondered if my memory, didn't match reality, because I thought they really played a team game with a lot of movement, good court spacing, and things like that. So what I did was I found just on ESPN, I stumbled into a Cavs game from 1988 between the Bulls and the Cavs. And this was before, Michael was just on the way up. The Cavs had all these young guys. And it was just magnificent basketball to watch if you like passing and you like not just wild 3-point shooting, but 3-point shooting when you're open and working the ball into the low post with Brad Doherty and pick and rolls with Doherty and Price, Hot Rod Williams and Larry Nance blocking shots. The X's and O's with Lenny Wilkins are so good, and Doug Collins doing the same with the Bulls, of course, trying to stop Michael. It was fabulous basketball. And I love basketball, but I'll tell you, sometimes these teams shooting up 40 to 53 pointers a game, I have a hard time with it. I really do. All right, another question. Can Terry talk about the championship with LeBron James? And does Terry ever talk to fans at games? I'll talk to fans if I see them when I'm walking through the stands. When I do, of course, right now there's no fans in the stands. It's very weird covering things, but where I really seem to connect with fans a lot is through email, or sometimes things on my Facebook page, or just I run into people a lot. I mean, that's the advantage of having been worked in this Northeast Ohio market for 40 years. Actually, it's even more than that now. It's 41. People recognize you and they come up and they talk to you, and I'm glad they did. Or like when I do a lot of library talks or that kind of thing, get to do that. In the championship with LeBron James, became very interesting because I wrote the book The Comeback, and it's still a pretty good book to read because it talks about LeBron leaving the first time, how the franchise went down, then all that it took to LeBron coming back. But I remember that I could actually write a story about a Cleveland team winning a title. And it was Father's Day, 2016, at Oracle Arena in Oakland. And the thing that I don't expect fans to know or to really understand is, as a newspaper guy, you're on deadlines. This is not like you have a lot of time after a game to write, that game being on the West Coast. So I was sitting with Bill Livingston at that point, who was still working for the Plain Dealer, and we're writing our stories, and that's a very tight game, Game 7. In fact, I'm looking at the clock and I'm realizing I'm going to have about 12, 15 minutes after this game to get it done. So I have one story on one screen, the Cavs losing Game 7, the title, and another one going on the other screen with them winning. So they got two really mediocre, disjointed stories going at the same time. And as it got closer, and then suddenly, LeBron blocked that shot. The famous chase down block that he had on Andre Iguodala. And then there was another thing where you saw Kevin Love, of all people, come up and force a bad shot on Steph Curry. And then I'm looking at, they're actually going to win. And then I'm thinking, somebody's going to want to read this. And I'm thinking, I have hardly any time. I can't choke. And because basically, in terms of winning, losing titles, is, story of a career. So I don't even remember what I wrote. I just remember kept yelling, what was the score? And it was 92 to 89, because the last thing you want to do is mess up the score. in when the Cavs won the title. And I think I just talked about the great shot by Kyrie, LeBron's block, Love's defense, coming back from 3-1, the first time ever. And then later on, I did a follow up, and this is the coolest thing. In fact, it kind of goes into the next question here. Do you think players are doing better or worse without stadium audiences? I can tell you right now, they love the crowd. So think about this scene now. So it's about 20, 30 minutes after the Cavs have beaten Golden State. And we have seen this so often in our venues, whether it's Progressive Field or, could have been Gund Arena, I'm sorry, or Rocket Mortgage Fieldhouse, whatever you want to call it, where our team loses in the playoffs and they're eliminated, and the other fans kind of take over the place and start chanting and clapping and that. But this time at Oracle Arena, which by the way is a little like the old Richfield Coliseum, great place to watch a game. All the Golden State fans are trudging out, quiet, heads down, almost like they're heading to a sports funeral. And seemingly out of nowhere come about 500 to 700 Cleveland fans. And they come down the aisles and they ring the court and they start chanting, "Let's go Cavs. Let's go Cavs." And it was so cool. I really, not too often I say I got chills or whatever, but to see that, these transplanted Clevelanders on the West Coast, or a couple people I knew that, they had some money and they bought that ticket and it came out. It meant so much. And then, of course, at home, people just went out in the streets and were hugging each other and things. So I think that's one of the things where sports works really well, is that, all right, stick with me for a minute. I'm not going political, but watch how politics, you could throw out any issue almost. And right away, people will kind of go, the blue state view or a red state view. And in fact, if you sort of have an idea before what happens, the issue comes up kind of, oh, I know that person's a conservative, that one's a liberal or whatever. You just know this. But in sports, it's a great unifier, and it's also a great diversion from all the stuff that goes on. So first of all, the players do they may complain about the fans booing or whatever, but they don't like playing by themselves. I'll tell you that right now. And I'm not sure how much it's impacting their play. I do think you have lost, home field or home court or whatever. I know this in football, where a lot of times the fans can really impact the game. Like when the opposing team has the ball and they get real noisy and the players, the linemen, and cannot hear the quarterback snap count. Well, you don't have to worry about that. Now you got this phony noise pumped in, but it's not doing anything. And most of the players, not all, but most of them aren't, they play for an audience. And otherwise it almost feels like practice. And I just wonder too, the Cavs were almost feeding off of the negativity of the crowd and that night in Oracle Arena. LeBron said sometimes there's something great about going into an opposing arena in a big game and beating them and shutting up those home fans. And then on top of it, of course, what it did that night is it brought out the Clevelanders. So I think, it's very important on that to do this. So when you talk about, LeBron and that, and then see, when was the last time you were at the Coliseum? Well, probably whatever was the last game they played there. I think Mike Fratello was the coach that last year. And I just don't remember much about it, other than I was sad because I just liked that building quite a bit. Now, of course, while I grew up in Cleveland, when I left the Plain, I was the baseball writer at the Plain Dealer from 80 through 84. It's hard to believe there ever was a baseball writer before Paul Hoynes, but That was me. And then what I did was I went to the Beacon Journal. I was covering the Cavaliers in Akron, so I moved to Akron. And so I like the idea too, the Coliseum being it was. That's part of the reason I bought a place in West Akron. And then later, when I came back to the Plain Dealer, boy, it's now almost 14 years ago. Um, the house I'm sitting in now, it's still in West Akron, and it's paid for. So um, I didn't move. But so that was, that was a thing there. And what I really want to do, I'm gonna okay, hold up another book. It's there, the Browns Blues, and what I was thinking is this: I keep waiting for that book to get out of date, and maybe this year. And I want to say something to fans too, because I'm getting the Browns are 5-3, 5-3. Say it again: the Browns are 5-3. I didn't think they'd be 5-3. It's hard to remember the last time they were 5-3. I think it was 1994 or something like that. And let's enjoy this. Of course, this is not a perfect team or whatever. Just in the same way, those couple of Cavs teams I talk about were not perfect teams. The Indians of the 90s, Tom Hamilton and I wrote a book called Glory Days on the Indians of the 90s. And when we look back at it, those teams, they could really hit and they're fun to watch, but they were flawed. They had issues with their pitching and that. But, a big part of this is entertainment. And right now, instead of the Blues, I would say for the most part, we're kind of having the Browns fun here. They have some games where they score a lot of points and they have some guys that are fun to watch. And, people are almost like pounding themselves. Is Baker Mayfield going to be the franchise quarterback? Franchise quarterback, franchise quarterback, franchise quarterback. Stop. It's 8 games into the season. They're 5-3. Got 8 more games to figure out that. And then, frankly, he's under team control for 2 years after that. Sometimes what we need to do, and that includes some of us in the media, is just back off and have some fun when the teams are giving us something to have some fun about. So that's, kind of one of the things there. Because my Lord, think of all the, well, I'm going to even use a Browns term from Browns Blues. I remember when they fired Hugh Jackson, Jimmy Haslam came up and said, well, we're trying to deal with some, I like this phrase, internal discord. We need to stop this internal discord. Well, this whole country has internal discord. But one of the things that could remedy some of the internal discord is when we have some fun with our teams. And it is a shame that there aren't fans in the stands right now to enjoy this Browns team. I mean, they're letting in a limited number, and it's kind of weird when you go to the games and that, how they are. I mean, you could sort of hear the fans, but not as, not like normal. So I guess that's, one of the things too is I kind of wrap this up here and we talk about, if you have some more questions there, is that, I look at myself as a writer. Some people say, well, you're not as critical as some or people or whatnot. Well, number one, sports is not life and death. You go look at me, I got some real miles on my tires, bald tires. I've had people close to me die, others battling cancer, that kind of stuff. That's life and death. Or some of us, I've been doing jail ministry for over 20 years, and I run into parents when I'm coming in, they're waiting to visit their because it's always on the male side, their sons, um, and the kid's been on drugs forever. In fact, sometimes I may have to say that to somebody out there, to some of you. I'm going to just say this: you may have one of your adult children or whatever that's really struggling, and odds are it's probably not your fault. And we have spiritual battles where we beat ourselves up, but it's probably not. Almost every time when I run into a family member visiting somebody at the jail, for example, I said, "Do you have any other kids?" "Oh yeah, I got 3 others." And, "Well, how are the other 2 doing?" And one's a teacher and one's doing well in sales or whatever. And then there's this one. I'm like, well, if the other 2 are doing fine and this one's doing there, I mean, I don't think you should take total credit for the other 2 either. I mean, this is people make their own decisions. And some of us as parents or grandparents or, even adults that get involved in some of these situations where people are trouble, we need to give ourselves a break. Maybe go watch a good ball game too, just to kind of relax and lift that off. But I guess what I'm saying is this: I view sports as a diversion from real life. I prefer the teams to win. It's a lot more fun. When you hear these guys say, "Oh, you guys just want us to lose, it sells papers or whatever." No, I'll tell you what sells papers. Winning sells papers. When the Cavaliers won that title in 2016, we sold 536,000. That was the last number I saw. Copies of that paper with that front page with the Cavs winning. They didn't print that many the first time. They had to keep printing more and more. And then we kept printing special sections after it. Winning sells papers. Winning is fun. Winning brings people together. And then secondly, it's one of the things that it kind of comes from my faith-based writing, and my faith is that when I'm critical of somebody, I criticize the action, not the person, which by the way is good advice in real life or whatever. When we start with name calling and things like that, and I did that younger in my career, now and then I'll run into a story I wrote from a long time ago, and I just cringe, at that. Because name calling is kind of like once it comes out of your mouth, it's out there. It's like gum that's stuck in the bottom of your shoe. It's hard to get rid of. Uh, Whereas when you say, look, in that area, when you did that, that was wrong. In fact, teams often will be a little bit more upset with me when I criticize them than maybe somebody who's just screaming on talk radio or whatnot, because start throwing some facts out there and I'm hitting them where they live on their decisions and that, and that bothers them. So those are things too when it comes to writing. But most of all, what I want to do is I want to thank the people here who've been reading me all these years. I mean, I feel like my first assignment was covering Appomattox Courthouse and asking Robert E. Lee why he lost the Civil War. I mean, I've been gone back that long. Um, and secondly, how fans, many of you have stayed with me for, it's over 30 books now. It's a million stories. I don't know how many stories, probably too many stories that I've written over the years, changing, the faith stories now, especially in the last year. My faith columns, Faith in You, have been on the front page of the Metro section every Sunday, and they've asked me to keep writing them every week. It's been challenging, but fun to do that. And again, I'm just blessed to be able to write sports in Northeast Ohio where I grew up. And I really knew that because for 3 years I worked in Baltimore and I worked in Savannah and I worked in Greensboro, kind of like a player sort of working through the minors. And it made me a greater appreciation for, again, being at home, writing about the home teams, writing for fans for here. So I just want to thank you all very much. One last shot at a question.
Oh, Terry, we do have one question. Oh, we have two questions in the chat now.
Okay.
The first one that popped up is from another Terry, and the question is, if you've ever considered writing something about the Ohio professional wrestling scene?
No. And it's nothing wrong with that. I just know nothing about wrestling. And you would need to find somebody who really loves it. In fact, it just wasn't my sport or whatever. But Lord knows there's been enough tremendous wrestlers and wrestling coaches from this area.
All right. Well, very good. I think that does answer our questions. Oh wait,
Here's one. Looks like
there's one from Julia. Okay.
Is that what is your closest friendship Terry has had with a pro athlete?
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, I mentioned World Be Free. He and I got to be close that year. I covered with the Indians. Dennis Martinez and Omar, we got along really, really well. Yeah. When I covered the Indians in the early 80s, he only was there about a year. It's not Mike Pagel, the Browns quarterback. It was Carl Pagel, his brother, who played. And sometimes what you do is you get to be friends with guys who are marginal. I mean, a player I got to know him as a player with the Cavaliers, and I still stay in touch with Steve Kerr, who now coaches Golden State, because he was a bench warmer just hanging on with the Cavaliers. And oftentimes now in my job, especially I became a columnist, I become more with coaches or general managers because those are people I talk to more often. So Um, you know what I have found that I think sometimes media people look uh, at these players, and they want these players to be so articulate and so interesting. Well, usually the reason they became a pro at anything is because they had tunnel vision, this, and so that oftentimes they aren't, as they would say, like real articulate, real interesting when you interview them. And oftentimes too, the feeling is from the players, you're going to come by, talk to me for 2 minutes, and you don't really care about me, and we're gone. Uh, but I would say now, even before the pandemic, with all the restrictions and everything where they close down access and that, it's much more difficult for people in the media to get to know the players than it used to be. So that's just another battle. Well, all right. So that does it. We're ending with a Carl Pago reference, and one last view of my two guest hosts or guest stars. Here, come on, Joe. Here we go. All right, Joe Tate, World Be Free. Say goodbye to everybody there. And
Well, thank you so much, Terry, for presenting as you do almost every year, I think, with us. And thanks for our participants who've been part of the presentation this afternoon. Again, visit the website buckeyebookfair.org to see all of the books and to buy autographed copies of Terry's book. So thank you all so much. Have a great afternoon. And our next presentation is this evening at 6:30 on Ohio politics.